In this lesson, we'll be taking a very quick look at the remaining geometries that V-Ray offers. In the Create panel and Geometry tab, if you select V-Ray category, you can see we have a list of V-Ray geometries. We discussed V-Ray Proxy, V-Ray Fur, and V-Ray Clipper, and now we'll be discussing the rest of them. In the Render Setup window, let's turn off GI. Now the default lights will kick in when we start the render. First, we have this V-Ray plane or infinite plane. If I select it and click once in the viewport, now we have an infinite plane, and if I go ahead and render the scene, we get this infinite plane, and you can apply any material to it if you wanted to. And if I go to its modify panel, we don't have any specific parameters. Let me delete this plane. We have V-Ray sphere. If I select it and click and drag in the viewport, we can create a sphere. And if I render the scene, we get an absolutely perfect round sphere. Let's delete this sphere as well. Next, we have V-Ray instancer or particle instancer, and this allows you to instance any object on particles from a particle flow system. First, let's go to the particle systems category and create a particle flow system in the scene. Rotate it 180 degrees. Now if I go through the timeline, we have some particles from a particle flow system in the scene. And if I render the scene right now, we have cube defined as the particle shapes. Let's go to the particle view and make sure we don't get any geometries from the particle flow. Now let's create a sphere in the viewport, and say we want to have an instance of this sphere over every particle. Okay, so let's add a V-Ray instancer. In the modify panel, first define the source object, which is the sphere in this case, then add the particle system. Now if I render the scene, we get our spheres where the particles are. Let me delete the sphere and the instancer. Also, let's move through the timeline so we can see more particles in the scene. We have V-Ray metaball. V-Ray metaball is a geometric primitive that can be used to create a ray traced metaball out of an existing particle system. The metaball is created at render time and is not generated as actual geometry. So let's select V-Ray metaball and click once in the viewport. In the modify panel and particles section, add the particle flow system to the positive particles. And if we render the scene, we get a metaball geometry in the render. We have some important parameters to control the shape of the metaball. Particle radius controls the overall radius of each sphere around the particle. So if I go to something like 15 from 20, we get a more defined result. Threshold controls how close the metaball is to the particles. So lower values move the surface away from the particles, while higher values make the surface cling close to the particles. So let's try 0.1, 0.5, and 1. Let's set it to something like 0.8 here. We have step length, which is the main control for quality versus render time of the metaball's surface. Lower values produce a more precise surface but may take more render time. Higher values reduce render time but can produce artifacts. Let's try 0.1, 0.5, and 1. And finally, we have V-Ray volumetric, which is an important one, and we'll be talking about it in the next section, which will be about atmospheric and volumetric effects in V-Ray. So in this lesson, we talked about varied geometries, and I will see you in the next lesson.